We've all heard the name Jeffrey Epstein, right? It's infamous. But the real question, the one we're digging into here, is how his criminal network managed to operate in plain sight for decades. That's the real story. You see, it's not just about one man. It's about the entire system, the money, the influence, and the institutions that made it all possible.
Look, we're not here for the sensational headlines. We're here to understand the playbook, the actual mechanics of power, money, and institutional failure that allowed all of this to happen for so long. So let's break it down.
So to really get to the bottom of this, you got to look at the three main pillars of his whole operation: the financial empire that funded it all, the global network of influence that shielded it, and of course, the repeated failures of justice that let it continue.
All right, first up, the money. This was the fuel for the entire machine. Epstein's wealth was absolutely immense, and its origins were, famously shrouded in mystery. But that money was the key that unlocked the doors to the world's most powerful circles.
I mean, his rise was just meteoric and frankly pretty bizarre. He didn't even have a college degree, but he talked his way onto Wall Street. But the real game changer, that was the Wexner connection. Once he started managing the fortune of the billionaire founder of Victoria's Secret, he went from being a boutique consultant to a genuine financial powerhouse. That gave him the capital to build his infrastructure, starting, of course, with that infamous private island.
And this number gives you a sense of the scale we're talking about. $1.5 billion. That's how much money in suspicious transactions flowed through some of the biggest banks in the world. This wasn't just some guy with a big bank account. This was the financial lifeline of a criminal enterprise.
In this slide, wow, it just lays the systemic failure out in black and white. And these weren't mistakes, they were decisions. Think about it. JP Morgan Chase kept him on as a VIP client for 5 years after he was first convicted, and they knew they had internal warnings about human trafficking. And when they finally cut him loose, Deutsche Bank just picks him right up, processing millions in payments to his co-conspirators. Wall Street wasn't just complicit, it was an active facilitator.
So all that money, it wasn't just sitting in an account. It was used to build this sprawling, global network of properties and relationships. And each piece, as you'll see, had a very specific and very sinister purpose. Let's take a look at the anatomy of that network.
Yeah, Little St. James, you got to understand, this place wasn't a vacation home. It was a purpose-built fortress designed from the ground up for control. With access limited to his private boats and helicopter, victims were totally trapped. And according to testimony and evidence, the buildings themselves were literally weaponized with hidden cameras and recording devices. It was an environment of total, terrifying surveillance.
And his other assets were just as specialized. You had the infamous Boeing 727, nicknamed the Lolita Express, which was basically the transport hub of the whole network, flying people between his properties. And then you have the Zorro Ranch out in New Mexico, which, this is where it gets really strange. This was apparently the headquarters for his twisted ambition to, get this, launch a modern-day eugenics project.
So the big question is, how did he do all of this so openly for so long? Well, it boils down to a strategy called elite capture. He wasn't just buying access, he was buying the prestige of institutions like Harvard and MIT. His donations weren't charity, they were a tool to launder his reputation. At MIT, it got so blatant that staff were allegedly told to call him Voldemort, he who must not be named, just to keep his name out of the system. This was a deliberate strategy to build this social force field that made powerful people just look the other way.
And that social shield, man, it proved incredibly effective when the law finally came knocking. And that brings us to the first, and maybe the most shocking institutional collapse, the absolute failure of the justice system down in Florida.
It all started back in 2005 with a single, brave family who filed a report. And for a couple of years, it seemed like the system was actually working. Police and federal prosecutors were building this massive, what should have been an airtight case. They had dozens of victims. And then, just like that, it all stopped.
This is where then U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta steps in and brokers this secret deal, a non-prosecution agreement that has been called, rightly so, a national disgrace. Epstein served just 13 months, and most of that was on work release. But here's the absolute worst part of it all. The deal gave immunity not just to Epstein, but to his named co-conspirators. It basically slammed the door shut on the entire federal investigation and protected his whole network for another 10 years.
So, how did that decade of immunity finally come to an end? Well, you can thank investigative journalism for that. It kicked off a whole new chapter of arrests, lawsuits,
and eventually a level of public disclosure that's pretty much unprecedented.
In 2018, the Miami Herald published this incredible series that just blew the lid off that secret 2008 deal. The public was outraged, as you can imagine, and it forced federal prosecutors in New York to finally take action. Epstein was arrested in July 2019, but just 1 month later, he was found dead in his cell. His death was ruled a suicide.
But look, his death was nowhere near the end of this story. In many ways, it was the beginning of a massive public audit. Thanks to a series of court-ordered releases, we're now seeing millions of pages of documents being made public, and they are shedding a whole new light on just how extensive this network really was.
And the fallout from these documents? It's been huge, and it's global. You've got these massive banks like JP Morgan paying out hundreds of millions in settlements for their role in all this. You have powerful, prominent figures from around the world facing intense new scrutiny about their connections. The focus has really shifted, you know? It's not just about Epstein the man anymore. It's about the powerful people and the powerful institutions that made up his entire network.
So, when you step back and look at all of this, decades of evidence, a really clear pattern starts to emerge. A playbook, really, for how extreme wealth can just systematically bypass the guardrails that are supposed to protect the rest of us.
And it really comes down to this three-step process. Step 1, financial obscurity. You use shell companies. You use complicit banks to hide and launder your money. Step 2, institutional legitimacy. You use that dirty money to buy yourself prestige, donating to elite universities and creating a social force field of respectability. And finally, Step 3, legal manipulation. If you do get caught, you use your power, your money, your connections to bend the legal system and get a deal that protects not just you, but your entire operation.
And that brings us right back to where we started. You see all these documents coming out. This isn't the end. It's the beginning of a massive public audit of the banks, the universities, the political systems, all the institutions that let this happen. The real question now is, what will we do with what we've learned?